Hey everybody, hope you're doing well as we get to this point in week 8. I guess if you're listening to the lecture, it's the last half of week 8, so I hope it's been a good week for you, and I'm glad you're here. This week we're going to transition into thinking some more practical thoughts about strategy and program in ministry, but before we do that, I thought it might be good to think about how we'd want things to end up. The old adage, beginning with the end in mind, might be appropriate here, but really I want us to think about how we'd like things to end up with the students who are part of a youth ministry that either we lead or that we have some influence over. So, for example, if the youth group community was known by the way it lived out or bore witness to the fruit of the Spirit. You know this passage, you're really familiar with it, but what if this was kind of like the vision statement or the mission statement? And that ministry was shaped so that kind of the finished product of ministry was that young people lived out this sort of life. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance or patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. Now, that's a good mission statement or vision statement for what we'd like to see adolescents live out or bear witness to in a youth ministry. But I like the way that Eugene Peterson says this in the Message translation. He says, what happens when we live God's way? That He brings gifts into our lives, much the same way that fruit appears in an orchard. Things like affection for others, exuberance about life, serenity. And when I think about those things right there, I think about someone who has a deep sense of worth. It's the kind of worth that's cultivated in a life of worship. That's that image of God dynamic, and you see it kind of implied right there. Exuberance about life, serenity, peace, affection for others, no longer self-centered but other-centered, right? A sense of compassion in the heart and a conviction that we develop a willingness to stick with things, a sense of compassion in the heart, which again makes me think about that dynamic of being authorized by God to make things right in the world. Now we've got a motivation and a willingness to stick with it. And we're doing it out of a sense of compassion for others that comes from the heart, transformed from the inside out. Along with that, he goes on to say a conviction that a basic holiness permeates things and people. We find ourselves involved in loyal commitments. Even that describes the nature of what we'd like relationships to be like, right? Wouldn't you love for adolescents to see all things around them and all people that they encounter, whether it's peers, whether it's parents, whether it's other adults, as people with whom a basic holiness is permeating? That we would find ourselves in loyal commitments to one another, not thinking about meeting our own needs, but maybe perhaps bringing dignity to others. You see in the fruit of the Spirit how it even manifests itself in terms of those three dynamics that we're made for by virtue of the fact that we're created in the image of God. So isn't this a decent aim for youth ministry then, that adolescents would be introduced to life this way, that they'd have the chance to practice at life this way, so that they could integrate this kind of life as the norm of their existence, so that they'd be fully integrated into the body of Christ, the local body of Christ, but then they'd also be integrated into God's grand story, that meta-narrative. They find their place in that story that orients their own story and now brings it to life. This would be forming a life of shalom, life the way it was meant to be in them, right? Well, in our world, unfortunately, this is not the reality. This is not what people think about when they think about what the gospel actually is. The French philosopher and theologian Jacques Ellul said several decades ago, the world no longer listens to the gospel. The Word of God no longer penetrates into the reality of human life. People seek other solutions, listen to other promises, to other gospels. It may not seem that there is much interest in that sort of life that we just described, or at least there's not much interest in that sort of life as others see it and hear it described. So Ellul says no one's listening. But this isn't because that there are these secularizing powers in the world that are overwhelming the gospel, but because they find other solutions and their promises that they bring with them. They seem to find those as more helpful. So this is what James K. Smith calls rival liturgies or rival narratives. People don't remain in a gospel vacuum. They'll find another one, and there are plenty of others out there that promise to meet their deepest needs, although they never deliver. So what's the problem then? If it's not an overwhelming secular force, but people still aren't drawn to the gospel, what's the problem? Well, Walt Mueller, who's the founder of the Center for Parent Youth Understanding, cpyu.org. If you've never visited cpyu.org's website, you ought to. If you love kids, if you're in ministry, if you're a parent, if you're a parent of teenagers, if you know parents of teenagers, this is an outstanding resource. Podcasts, blogs, great resources for youth workers, for parents about trends in culture, all sorts of great stuff. Predominantly American culture, I'll have to tell you that. Nonetheless, some really, really good resources for you. But this is what he says in one of his books, Engaging the Soul of Youth Culture. The problem is with the messengers of the gospel. Now that hits a little close to home. I've been in youth ministry for a really long time, and maybe that puts you on the defense just a bit. But let's just think about this from the perspective of what we've seen so far in our reading. Remember that the research shows that a majority of committed Christian kids can only articulate what Christianity is against. Do you remember reading that in The First Year Out by Tim Clydesdale? He was quite surprised that the committed Christian kids couldn't even say really what their Christian faith was for. And then the same sort of thing was confirmed in the National Study of Youth and Religion that was conducted about 10 or 12 years ago. It was published in the book Soul Searching, where Christian Smith said that the Christian kids, committed Christian kids who had a high degree of participation in church, youth group, good family support, were part of evangelical church communities, even those kids, he said, were surprisingly inarticulate about the positive aspects of their faith. So what this means is that the message that kids have heard, quote unquote, not necessarily what we've said, but the reality is what they've heard is what they articulate back and what's been reinforced in them in contemporary youth ministry, of which I've been a part for a long time, and in the church, and in their families, their Christian families, is mostly what Christianity is against. What has not been reinforced is what is Christianity for? Life lived God's way, perhaps, as Eugene Peterson likes to say it. So what that means is, as we think about this Venn diagram that we've used, and we said that ministry really needs to attend to all three of these circles, but the reality is that what they've learned more than anything else is that this is our primary concern, our kingdom. So they may not be saying, oh yeah, Christianity is about idolatries, oppression, and exploitation. But what they've taken in, what's been formed in them essentially is that Christianity is just against stuff like having things, material possessions and stuff, or just against fun, or against parties, or against sex, whatever you want to call it. And all those things find their place within those distorted versions of the image of God we've talked about before. It's just in their own terms or their own language. That's in essence where we've zeroed in, maybe whether we intended to or not. Do you remember in the James K.A. Smith reading that I had you, that one chapter I had you read a couple weeks ago, where he said that a lot of youth ministry relies on entertainment and attractional programmatic ministry out of fear? And a number of you kind of push back on that, and I think in a good way. I don't want us to throw the baby out with the bathwater and get rid of programmatic ministry. I don't even want to get rid of entertainment. It's a big part of Young Life ministry that I've been a part of for so long. So a number of you push back in a good way, but what this might reveal and what we really ought to think about is a couple of things. And that is that perhaps in youth ministry especially, we might have been over time more concerned with the numbers that showed up than whether or not we've actually formed in them what life in Christ is for. Maybe we've paid more attention to how many people have come without really asking ourselves the right kind of questions about whether or not we've been part of their formation. And so without realizing it, the other thing that's happened is the unintended consequence that we've reinforced the behaviors we need to avoid And this is what I think James Smith is talking about with regard to fear, is that we probably have done that out of the fear that if we don't, we might lose our kids. So we've done this at the expense of inviting them into and helping them take hold of a flourishing life the way that Peterson describes in that Galatians passage as God's way. So when we think about this film, Perks of Being a Wallflower, we shouldn't be surprised when religion is depicted as maybe traditional or perhaps sentimental, or even, with some rote traditions that, depending on your background, might seem normal or it might seem weird, but it's otherwise irrelevant to the main drama taking place in the lives of Charlie, Sam, and Patrick. It comes across essentially as irrelevant. And now listen, I understand it's a Hollywood movie, and Hollywood is inherently biased against traditional Christianity. But wouldn't you at least want someone to say, in the midst of a room like that basement scene where they were all gathered, they called it the Island of Misfit Toys, that wouldn't you just want someone to say, in the midst of our anxiety, our sense of abandonment, our frustration, our fears, our lack of direction or vision, wouldn't you want someone to say, hey, do you think maybe we ought to see what the church might have to say to us? Or do you know any Christians? It seems like they live a different kind of life. Maybe we should ask them how we deal with the situation we find ourselves in. Now, a lot of you recognize in this assignment that we'd have to really do ministry intentionally, and I think by that you mean differently, to bring the gospel, to bring shalom, the fruit of the Spirit, to bear in the life of a Charlie or a Sam or a Patrick. And if the church or a ministry is not even on their radar screen right now, we've got to do things differently, right? And I feel like that was a very good part of your work you did in this particular assignment. So we need to think about that part of our motivation for designing ministry strategy. And that's essentially really why I asked you to do this assignment in the middle of the quarter, because I wanted to start the process of you thinking about not just what it takes to reach the kids that we currently reach, but what would it take to reach Charlie or Patrick or Sam, because it's going to have to be different, right? We're going to have to do things differently in order for that to happen. And I think in essence, if the data is right, then in our current state, what Charlie or Patrick or Sam perceive is that they represent what Christianity is against, and that Christianity, based on observations, doesn't have anything to offer. Now, I get that there are, if you're thinking a little defensively, but we would, that's great. I know there are exceptions, but I'm just speaking in generalities here right now. Okay, so some of this actually is happening probably because of the way that the contemporary youth ministry was born, out of the heritage of its beginning in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And if you remember reading that chapter I wrote for you, The Brief History of Youth Ministry in the West, you heard me say that there was this third phase of youth ministry that really is kind of our current contemporary phase, but it was what I call the neo-missional phase. It was kind of a revivalist movement where ministry was born. So in those days of youth ministry, if you built it, then they would come. And they did come, and there was good reason for that. Think about what was happening at that time in American history. And in the United States, that's essentially the labor and delivery room for modern youth ministry. But at that time, the U.S. was coming out of the austerity of the Great Depression. The segment of the population known as teenagers was beginning to be recognized. That's when that term was coined in the 1940s. And there was this kind of patriotic, religious enmeshed enthusiasm, also either leading up to or in the midst of or coming out of World War II, that created a kind of electricity that energized these things that began to take place, these emerging youth rallies and gatherings. And so, in other words, you really could just build it. You could announce it. You could have a rally, and there was enough in the ethos or the air, enough electricity to energize these things to happen in a kind of a revivalist movement. And this could work. You could have this kind of ministry because, as I told you before, that we lived at a time where there was sort of a sacred canopy, where our big institutions that helped us construct reality and support our beliefs were essentially in alignment. But they're not anymore. We don't have that sacred canopy anymore. So now we have to think differently. We have to think that if we're really serious about reaching kids that are the farthest out from Jesus, the perks of being a wallflower type kids, we have to be committed to doing something different. And that is an element of our ministry, has to be committed to going where they are, to meet them where they are. Because remember, the landscape has changed. We talked about this before, that we had at the time when the youth ministry really kind of came into its own, that perhaps culture looked something like this. There was a large segment of the population that was Christian, or a segment of the population that had decent understanding of Christianity but was just bored or uninterested in it. Because, again, with the sacred canopy, the prevalence of Judeo-Christian values, this was just the air that most people breathe, at least in the U.S. And then as our times have come about, contemporary youth ministry, the axis has moved, and we would say that this is probably what the landscape is like now. A lot more people who are now in this quadrant 4 category, where there's little or no exposure because Judeo-Christian values don't permeate the air anymore. And there's just little interest. There are rival liturgies that seem to offer solutions that are compelling, and they will pursue those instead. Now, we could, make an argument about whether or not this is an accurate depiction of what's happened. I just created this for a visual way to see the change over time. Maybe my axis is not moved to the right scale and all that, but if we got bogged down in that, I think we'd miss a larger point. Because again, you think about that picture that I just showed you before. Look at the kids in the room. Let me go back to this and I'll just show you. Look who the kids in the room were right here. They're all white kids, and if we're gonna judge a book by its cover, those are probably all middle class or upper middle class white kids. Those were the ones who really did seem to kind of dominate youth ministry right here. But if we get bogged down thinking about, did this axis move the right way? Is this really kind of what our landscape is like right now? We'd miss a larger point, and that is that certainly ministry in its beginnings missed a significant section of the population, whether it was related to race or socioeconomics. So again, because the landscape has changed in so many ways, we have to think of doing ministry differently. So in light of that, I want to encourage you, if you haven't already made this your practice, to start thinking or to begin to embrace or to run with passion so that you don't forget those that will not likely to be drawn in by an attractive sort of invite your friends gathering of kids that imitates the current cultural forms, relies on popular culture and its entertainment style or contemporary type music. So in other words, it relies a lot on being entertaining. I want to encourage you to think about a style that is incarnational, or we might even call it missional. And it involves this idea of contact work. Contact work really is just a name probably developed by the founder of Young Life, Jim Rayburn, back in the 40s. A way of describing going where kids are, entering their turf, not just inviting them to yours, but going where they are to build a bridge of unconditional friendship. And that's a really key phrase that we'll come back to in a minute, for the purpose of bringing an awareness of God's love to them. At its simplest, really, what contact work is going to where they are. In the U.S., that might be thinking about a school and all the events or activities that take place around a school. That's not always the true in other parts of other communities or other parts of the world. So it could be a number of ways, but the main idea is that you think about all the places that adolescents tend to gather, and you work to find yourself in the midst of them. So it would involve in being seen wherever kids are. So going where they gather, it means things like in the U.S. around a high school, this might be Um, being at sports games or volunteering to chaperone at a school dance or gaining permission to enter the cafeteria to visit, or being a lay coach for a sport, or volunteering to help with student council or the debate team, or volunteering with drama, or being a tutor at the school. But it's being present and being seen with students. It's learning their names. It's essentially earning the right to listen. If you read Hurt 2.0, you remember how Chap Clark talked about the world beneath, which was, I thought, very much depicted in Perks of Being a Wallflower, because it really was underneath the house in the basement there. But no one just wandered down there. You had to earn the right to listen before you even got the chance to enter into that world beneath. That's what we have to think of first. We show up, and over time, we earn the right to listen. And then things begin to go deeper. We start having conversations with kids. As trust rises, as their suspicion of who we are and why we're there begins to subside, then conversations at a variety of levels, ranging from the superficial to the deeper type discussions regarding what they think about things, their opinions or their feelings, those begin to take place. A lot of times it's kids that you already know that are your avenue to meeting new kids where these kind of conversations can take place. But again, we have to make sure that we're not just using our kids that we know in order to meet other kids. That would be one of those adult agendas that Hurt 2.0 warns us so much about. And then over time, as those conversations deeper, as trust increases, then we win the opportunity to begin to do activities with kids. Maybe we just call that hanging out with them wherever they are. But it's building deeper relationships with young people by taking time to do things with them, the kind of things that they like to do. It might be listening and discussing their music with them. It might be doing activities that they like, whether it's outdoors activities, it's video game activities, any number of things kind of in their world, on their turf, sharing a meal with them. It's face to face. It's not through social media. Social media is a means of communication, but it's not the same thing as a shared experience or a face-to-face type activity. So that's just a little brief overview of what contact work is, but let me talk about some of the things that I've heard through the years that can be the obstacles or the barriers, the reasons that we don't want to or shouldn't do contact work. So if you're training volunteer youth leaders, staff to engage in this incarnational missional type of ministry, these are the kind of things that you might hear people say. You might say that, I skipped a whole slide. I think I kind of said this. It's essentially this: winning the right to be heard, building a bridge of friendship and trust, meeting people where they are, showing up and listening. I think we got the gist of that, right? Okay, now here's the things that we hear people say that are kind of our excuses against contact work. I don't have the time. I want to, but I'm supposed to be in my office. And this might be true for volunteers who have inflexible jobs. They just can't leave their office. But sometimes it's people who work in youth ministry, because the ethos or the idea of doing your job and a church staff is you're doing your job when you're in your office. So that's an expectation that you have to figure out how to work around there. Maybe it's, I'm just not sure I relate as well at the school or wherever kids are as I do at the youth group meeting. Or can we just concentrate on making the youth group great? I mean, if it's really rocking and great, then people are going to come, right? And that takes care of this. Or can we get our student leaders to do it? They're already at the school or the place where kids are. We can teach them kind of how to be missionaries in their community. That's all true. I just don't think it's a substitute for adults going into that world. And then sometimes legitimately wouldn't parents be concerned about the kind of kids who'd come? Because if our youth group is quadrant 1 or 2, maybe 3 kids, and then suddenly we start bringing in quadrant 4 kids, Perks of Being a Wallflower type kids, is that going to raise the eyebrows of parents? Maybe start asking questions. What kind of influence are they going to bring to the youth group? Those are the kind of things that we might have to deal with when we're contending with excuses about contact work. But let's be honest about contact work. Really, the biggest barrier is often fear. Because being ignored is painful, and so is being rejected. It is an investment of a lot of time, which may not translate into large numbers. But then again, that's probably because we got the wrong expectation for what contact work is, that we've seen it as a means to something else rather than relationships themselves. But I would say that it's crucial for reaching the farthest out and disinterested kid. All right, there's a tension that we have to pay attention to in contact work, and it really comes from a core commitment to two uncompromising values. And the first is that we're building unconditional friendship. And the second is that we are called as ministers of the gospel to preach Christ, to make Christ known and life in his kingdom. We're called to make what Christianity is for known to those that we work with. So those two kind of exist in tension. We've got to be committed to both of those as core values at the same time. If we don't, here's what happens. If we don't maintain both those commitments, unconditional friendship without preaching Christ will become ministry dominated by fear. We'll just always be in non-judgmental, unjudgmental relationships with kids, but we'll be afraid to take the opportunity that the Spirit gives us to make Christ known so that Christ can speak into the broken places in their life. However, if we, without listening to the Spirit, seize the opportunity to begin to speak about Christ without having earned the right through an unconditional, non-judgmental friendship, then we can easily be perceived as having an agenda. You're here because you want me to listen to you, or you're here because you want me to come to your event. You don't really have a commitment to our friendship. After all, this is more about your job or your role or what you're paid for. So we have to hold a commitment to unconditional friendship, which is a challenge because we see a lot of broken stuff in the lives, especially of disinterested kids. But they're dying for relationships without agendas. And yet at that same time, if we're listening to the Spirit will work its way into the life of kids and create opportunities for us to make Christ and life in his kingdom known. So we have to be committed to both of those at the same time. A helpful metaphor that some writers who write about missional style ministry say is that we go as personified trailers, as in movie trailers, that personified trailers of the New Jerusalem, the flourishing life of Shalom and God's kingdom come to earth with all the best bits on display. That's who we are as adults going into the world of kids. However, it's got to be genuine, right? We've got to be people who are living this out in reality. We've got to be the ones who live out that flourishing fruit of the Spirit life, because we are doing the kind of things, living the kind of life, engaging in the kind of habits that allow our image-bearing dynamics to be out in front of us. Our sense of worth comes from our worship of God. Our sense of rightness comes from joining in with him because we know we're authorized to do it. And the way that we treat people is shaped by a commitment to giving and receiving in relationships and bringing dignity to bear there. Those can't be things that we just pretend to be about. I think we'll be exposed pretty quickly. Just like, sometimes in a bad movie you see a trailer that makes it look good, but you see the actual movie and you realize they only showed you the good parts in the trailer and the rest of the movie is terrible. I don't think we want to be exposed for being frauds, for being those kind of missional trailers and only showing the parts we want people to see in that moment. It's got to be something that draws people to us because we are living authentically God's way, as Peterson says. But if we're genuinely displaying that true lived out trailer of the life lived God's way, as we go then as imitators of Jesus, because remember, he came to us. John 1:14, again, Peterson's translation in the Message says that God became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. And at the same time, you think about the life of Jesus, he was absolutely committed to those two core commitments of unconditional friendship or relationships with others while making the kingdom known. He did both of those at the same time with equal commitment, right? So we're just going in Jesus' stead. We're doing it like he did. And this was his preferred way of ministry. Darrell Guter, who was at one time the training director for Young Life and later the academic dean of Princeton Seminary, said it this way in one of his books. He said, "By incarnational ministry, the practice of Christian witness is rooted and shaped by Jesus. Jesus didn't set up shop and invite people to come join him. Instead, the mission of Jesus was to go into homes, on boats, in the vineyards, and on the countryside, alongside ordinary people living their ordinary lives. And Guter goes on to say that this style of incarnational witness comes in Jesus' injunction after the resurrection and before the ascension, as he is reinstating his disciples in the upper room in John 20, verse 21. He says, remember this, as the Father has sent me, I'm sending you. So again, we're sent in the same style, the same pattern as Jesus. We just do what Jesus typically did to invite the unlikely outsiders that didn't fit in his time in other ways, to invite the outsiders that didn't fit in other ways of life into the kingdom of God. That's what Jesus did, and that's what we do by going to them. So if I were going to train staff or volunteers in a ministry to do incarnational ministry, I think we have to teach and encourage them to remember that we go with the kind of confidence that we already know the deepest desires of our target audience, adolescents, because they're human beings created in the image of God. And at their deepest level, they desire true worth that is intrinsic, that is steady and solid, and it's not a marketplace value that goes up and down based on how good their day at school was that day. That they long for rightness, to use the inherent autonomy or authority they have, authorized by God, to make things right, to do things that matter. And that they long for relationships, the nature of which are defined by giving and receiving, by a kind of dignity that the rest of the world doesn't know. That's their deepest desires. Now, they may say that their deeper desires are something else, but we can go with the confidence to know that their theological longings, their worth, rightness, and relationships that bring dignity is really foundational for them. It's not money or fame or popularity or sex or parties or likes on social media or whatever they say they may think that it is. They just either haven't or can't go deep enough yet in their desires. But you notice that Jesus was never afraid to ask questions of desire. What is it that you want? What do you want me to do for you? He didn't say, what do you know? Or what can you do? He would often say, what do you want? Because he wasn't afraid that this was going to take him somewhere in the realm of desire that he didn't know how to get out of. He already knew where it was going to lead to, because he understood the nature of being created in the image of his Father. And so do we. So while we keep those core commitments of unconditional friendship, non-judgmental friendships, where we stay engaged with them with no agenda other than to listen to the Spirit when the Spirit says this is our time to preach Christ, we keep those core commitments in place. We simply engage them around these three dimensions of life right here. So we're listening for, what are you interested in? We're listening for allegiances, not so that we can point them out and we can convict them of their idolatry, but so that we can hear what it is that they value and what they give themselves to. And conversations over time can circle around that. What do you do? This is about authority, the ways they use their power or the way that it's used against them. We're communicating that their value is not based on what they do for others. I'm sorry, rather this actually could be the opportunity to communicate to them that their value is based on what they do for others, their artistic abilities, their unique skills, not on how they perform, say, academically or athletically. We can elevate their abilities like musical interest too. I think these are all part of making things right in the world around them. So we can learn what they do, and we can affirm that. And then we can listen for and watch who they are in relationships with others, listening for examples of relationships that bring dignity and ones that seem to be exploitative or consuming. And we can explore the more positive ones with them. We can file the exploitative ones away for a conversation when the Spirit gives us the opportunity, or when we've earned the right to ask more questions and we've earned the right to be heard, to bring Christ into that conversation. So again, this is not just a strategy, because contact work has to come from a genuine way of being, right? That's the movie trailer analogy. If we can't do this, we can't live our lives genuinely, we can't live out genuinely what we're for, then I'd say don't go. Don't do contact work. Maybe that's a little extreme, but I think you get the idea, right? It's paramount that we have to be people who live out and know in our bones what we're for as followers of Jesus. So here's essentially the summary of this right here. If we're really serious about reaching those quadrant 4 kids, contact work ministry is about listening. It's listening to kids as we earn their trust, to hear their story of their life. It's listening to the Holy Spirit as He leads in His work of drawing them to Jesus. Okay, so I have to lay the groundwork for this important dimension of ministry, but I also want us to be able to think a little more strategically about how we create ministry, and that's going to lead us here. We've used this analogy a number of times, or this visual here, for us understanding the goal of youth ministry. And that is that we said it's kind of like a funnel that leads kids into adoption into the local body of Christ, or in a parachurch organization, it's a similar kind of funnel that itself ultimately leads to adoption in the body of Christ. But maybe if you haven't been thinking about this already, maybe the question that should be in the back of your mind is, well, what's the funnel? What does it look like? What creates a funnel in youth ministry? And so what I want to do is just give you some programmatic ideas that are generalizations about ministry that you can take and work with, or you can shape on your own in your own setting, or you can understand how ministry ought to be shaped so that it does ultimately kind of have a funnel effect. So here's a funnel for us to look at. And we can look at different dimensions or different types of ministry that kind of work their way down into the bottom there. So we'll start with kind of events that we could do that would be sort of entry-level events. They would cast the widest net to have a place for the largest number of kids. So characteristics of an entry-level event, I would say it ought to be born out of contact work, not relying on students to do this for you. You can say to students, bring your friends. I think that's okay, as long as we are not encouraging students to bring friends and then we're not doing the same thing. So I think we would say, I'm going to go bring my friends. Why don't you come with me? Let's meet some friends that we want to bring with us to this entry-level event. And our goal here is just a basic exposure to Christianity. Now, is this the same thing as an outreach event? Well, there would be debate about that. Some people would say this is our outreach effort here. I like to think that outreach really belongs out here, where we have made a sincere effort to build relationships of trust with those that are far outside of the church. We're not relying on being attractional. We're not relying on students to do this for you. We're the ones who are willing to go into this world to make friends and then bring our friends with us into that. So I think you have the best shot at getting quadrant 4 kids if you know them already, and then you bring them with you to an event like this. But if you rely on an approach that's influenced by that kind of historic revivalist mentality, which is often typical of outreach efforts, that it's more of an attractional model. It's designing what you do to reflect or be similar to the culture they already swim in, just cleaned up or slightly sanitized because it's a Christian event. You do that to get them to come into the door. We can probably assume that kids who will come in the door already have some measure of interest. They're probably quadrant 3 kids, low knowledge but relatively high interest. I say relatively compared to quadrant 4 kids. But as we said, especially high kids, they're well socialized to be suspicious of potential adult agendas. And so most of our quadrant 4 kids are probably not going to be that interested in coming to this sort of event, apart from relationships. What does this kind of event need? I've created a document for you that has these kind of notes in it, so you can just follow along right now. But if you want to download that document, if you want to pause right here, download that document if you haven't already, then you can follow along. But essentially, I'd say this. An entry-level event just needs to think about kids who have ventured in, who probably ordinarily wouldn't do this. And so it needs to be a warm, safe place where they're not going to be put on the spot and made to feel uncomfortable. They need to feel like they're welcomed and that we want to host them in this event. If you have the opportunity to create a large event like this, like a critical mass of kids, 25, 30, 40, 45 kids, then you can make it a high energy type event. But if it's a smaller gathering of kids, maybe it's in someone's home, maybe you're doing something together, watching a movie, maybe talking about it later, that's great. but I wouldn't try to make it an artificial high energy event. You can do things to get everybody involved. Just choose your games or your mixers widely to do that. But these are opportunities, I would say, to celebrate kids, not humiliate or embarrass them. So always let kids be winners in whatever kind of thing you do to generate involvement with one another. Music can be a part of that for sure. And then whatever you're going to communicate to them, I would say ought to be Christocentric. It ought to focus on the person of Jesus. It ought to bring him to life in a simple and understandable way. And then ideally, leaders, your volunteers who are part of this event will meet with students kind of as follow-up from this point to begin to earn that trust and help them in the process of becoming more involved in what you're doing. The next level in ministry would be what we might call our community building or discipleship type meeting. Oftentimes in church youth ministries, if we're going to do one event, this is probably it right here. This will be our one large group event. We're going to focus a little more on the more mature or the student who wants to be more mature, and it's going to be a discipleship type experience for them. So this is going to be a meeting for students who have a genuine relationship with Christ and who want to grow deeper. Now, this doesn't automatically mean that it excludes kids who are not Christians. Oftentimes, they like to kind of be in the periphery, be in the mix, but just observe what life in Christ is like through the ones who do want to grow deeper. What does this meeting need? I think it needs to give kids a chance to experience genuine worship experiences, but not just limited to singing songs together. I like what Mark Yaconelli emphasizes, a great book, Contemplative Youth Ministry. Highly recommend it to you. Also, a book by Mike King called... okay, great. And of course, my brain just kind of went out on me right here. Mike King's book, I'll think of it in just a little bit and tell you about it too, but both books along the same sort of line, which is helping kids learn practices that help cultivate a heart of worship in their life. So Yaconelli talks about an emphasis on prayer, on confession, on a larger view of creating a worshiping community, and also solidarity with the poor. Isn't that cool? So it'd be giving kids habits to expand their understanding of what worship is. But it also includes Bible study. And I would say Bible study that is very thoughtful. We're helping kids apply it to the many stage plays that they exist in. So remember, thinking about especially middle adolescents, we have to think about not just what this means here for us today in the youth group or wherever we are. What does it mean for us at home? And we need to talk that out. What does it mean for us at school? What does it mean for us on the sports team? What does it mean for us where we work? What does it mean amongst our peers? We have to help them think through what application in that setting is. Okay, and then the next level down, we would want to funnel kids down into what we call diversity of relationships or diverse relationships. So sometimes we think about this as small group ministry, which is great. It doesn't have to be small group ministry, but really it is exposing kids to a diversity of relationships with adults in the body. So small groups hopefully would be an invested adult, probably a non-parental adult, who does meet regularly with a small group of students and they process their discipleship together. But it could also be relationships with an adult who perhaps is he's in charge of sound for the Sunday morning worship service, and so he has a student who, or she has a student who works with him, kind of learns the ropes under him. But that relationship is not just about, hey, learning how to run the soundboard. It's a relationship of trust that sound person uses to walk with them, checks in with them during the week, maybe spend some time outside of the church service to could walk with them and their own discipleship there. So it's a diversity of relationships. It's in some ways remember the 5-to-1 ratio of adults to an adolescent. It's one of the 5 who know their name, care for them, who are so crucial in helping them own their Christian faith and for it to be formed in them. By the way, the Mike King book is called Presence-Centered Youth Ministry. I did think of it eventually. So Mark Yaconelli, Contemplative Youth Ministry, Mike King, Presence-Centered Youth Ministry. Okay, back on track right now. So diversity of relationships. It also could be that they maybe are part of certain teams in the church body, the worship team. Maybe they're musically inclined, even if they're not that great. What a way to get better by being part of talented musicians. Maybe they're part of the missions team, where they're learning how to do justice in their community or on a mission trip. Maybe it's part of the arts team, which would be a great thing because we just seem to have a vacuum for artists who do have gifts to share, who teach us what beautiful things are. We need to have a place for them, especially young people, to know that their creative gifts are gifts to us in the body. Maybe it's part of the welcoming team. Maybe our adolescents can be part of greeting others on Sunday morning worship services. There are a number of ways that we have adults come alongside them and a diversity of relationships so that we continue to move them down the funnel so we have more connections to the body itself there. Now, this might be the point where an outreach student, someone who's met Christ somewhere else through a parachurch ministry perhaps, can be plugged in here. If they know a leader who's gone into the world and met with them, earned trust, shared Christ, and walked with them through this experience, they may not want to start at the top of the funnel. Maybe it's here where this particular leader can bring them into the body of church and say, hey, come join in here at this place with me. You can help me in the worship team, or you can be part of this mission trip with me. I'm on the team that's planning this. This might be the point where they begin to get connected right here. And certainly they could be connected in this final part, what I've been calling the receiving, sending community. It's the adopting body right here, where kids are welcomed, they're adopted, where the larger body sees every kid as their kids, not just belonging to that family over there. So they see it's their responsibility to know them, and where the opportunity presents, they can be mentored or cared for, or at least so that kids can see this is how you live out the Christian life. They can watch it, they can observe it, they can practice with them, they can begin to develop some habits. They can kind of, see the cues and know what to do. I don't know if you've ever traveled, if you're in the U.S. and you traveled outside the U.S., I'm not sure quite how this works the other way since I'm an American. I'm not sure how we're perceived to the rest of the world, but I know I've been to other countries and I've been unbelievably surprised at the hospitality of other cultures. So you go abroad, if you're from the U.S., you visit that country, there's a little bit of anxiety about the language or the social cues or the way that things work. And then suddenly you find yourself interacting with someone in that country and you find they're so friendly and hospitable. They go out of their way, they stop what they're doing, they come alongside you, and they're genuinely humble and friendly. And maybe there's even like a language barrier going on there, but you're just amazed at how they literally take you in. It's disarming, right? When that happens. It's even inviting. Well, I think that these growing relationships in this receiving, sending community ought to reflect that kind of experience. There ought to be ways that we begin to give our adolescents a chance to learn, to watch the Christian life in action in the life of others, to kind of take it in, to practice, to begin to own for themselves the fruit of their deepest longings, kind of rightly oriented so they begin to discover, taste, and experience life the way it was meant to be, and to see that as their normative, the way that it should be. Because they are encouraged to do that, to engage in habits and practices that cultivate their worship, their and allegiance in their lives, to cultivate the opportunities to make doing justice more natural, to help them have the habit and opportunity to make things right in the world, where they regularly taste with intentionality through the wise guidance of adults in the context of relationships of trust that are reflective of dignity. And all the while that they're doing that, they are So they're growing in these kind of practices, ministry that reforms or transforms their deep theological longings in the way that they were meant to be, so that they come to fruition. That's fruit, right? And that becomes their normative. And then also in those relationships of trust, that they begin through those adults have embraced them in those diversity of relationships or the receiving sending community. They begin to bring into light the rival narratives or the other gospels that they have given themselves to and have been formed by without even really learning it. They bring those into the light in an appropriate sort of way in the context of these relationships, so that the kids begin to discover that these liturgies that they've given themselves to, these rival narratives, have overpromised, never delivered, and that they've actually enslaved them. And this is the means to bringing what Christianity is for out front and center, not at the expense of what we're against. We don't want to suppress that. That's important, because we do have to expose the rival liturgies, but it's so that we do both at the same time, but so that the fruit of life lived God's way, that Peterson phrase, is the gospel we live and we share and we bear witness to. I think in the West in general, and there are of course exceptions, but I'll generalize again, that the church is probably far down the list of places that adolescents might turn to, especially those who are outside the church. It's down the list of places that they might turn to find the things that you identified in your assignment on Perks of Being a Wallflower, that Charlie and Sam and Patrick seem to be searching for, such as belonging or identity. These are the kind of things you said in the assignment. It's a safe place to uniquely be themselves, looking for meaning and purpose, love and acceptance. Well, why is that? Why is the church far down the list? Could it be that we need to pay more attention to our core theological convictions? And by that really mean, can the local church or the ministry that we're a part of be seen to the wider culture as a place defined by hospitality and adoption? And in that environment of welcoming others in, of adopting them into the family, what's front and center is what we're for. Also paying attention to the rival liturgies that need to be unlearned or unwound in our lives. So you can see in this depiction here, it's almost like discipleship will kind of go in two directions, right? This is the big emphasis that you read about in Growing Young, and a number of you expressed that it really resonated with you. So what would it take for the church or ministry to be the place at adolescents, those already inside the church and those outside the church, to find the same sort of thing? The people are so friendly and hospitable. They go out of their way. They stop what they're doing. They come alongside you. They're genuinely humble and friendly. They take you in, kind of like visiting a foreign country and finding these hospitable people to your surprise, so that adolescents, find themselves as invited guests, that they are genuinely valued as such. This is one of the things I loved about that Greg Thompson lecture that I offered to you as extra credit. I'll just put a little plug for you again to go back and listen to that if you haven't, because he so powerfully says it's the virtue we have to recover. Greg Thompson made the case that the church needs to recover the core conviction of hospitality. Growing Young says that warm is the new cool. I don't know how you feel about your present ministry setting. And when I think about the church I presently attend there, I think we've got a lot of room to grow in that. We have tons of college students in our church, and I think a lot of times they're just attenders. But it's rare that we do a really good job, I think, of making them feel like they're a part of our body there. So we have work to go to, and maybe in your setting you feel the same way. A number of people have reported back to the Fuller Youth Institute that there seems to be this big gap between the values of Growing Young, the kind of things that seem to be resonating with young people in a church community, and where their present reality is. For a number of you, there is this big gap, and between where you are and where you'd like to be. And I understand that. I just want to say two things to that. One is that you are potentially one of the biggest influencers there is in that church community. And that's true whether or not you are a youth pastor or a youth worker in that church setting, or whether or not you just understand youth ministry now. You have the opportunity to bear influence on that setting. to remind adults of our responsibility to be people of hospitality, people of adoption, adopting others in. And that's a big responsibility for us as people who think we're focused primarily on kids. We can't just think there. We've got to think even beyond that. If we want to influence or shape this funnel, we have to be those who help influence or shape the receiving, sending community. So as big as that challenge is, the second thing I want to say to you is don't give up. Like Winston Churchill once said, never give up. It'll likely be a long, slow process. Just don't give up here. Okay, I'm going to summarize this in just a minute here, but I'll say one last thing about this funnel. The nature of this class is that people come into it from such diverse backgrounds that it's really, really a challenge for me in this format, in an online format, to say specifically, what should an entry-level event look like at your church, or a community building discipleship event look like in your church? It's just almost impossible to do that. So I would say this, some of you might be looking for more specific programmatic ideas, more specific material, more specific curriculum, all great stuff that ought to fit into this funnel. So I've created a Google document that's at the bottom of the module, and it's basically a place for you to share one or two of your best practices or best ideas. And this is how we can collaborate together and make this particular segment of the class really helpful to one another. So if you got a great idea, a great resource, something you love, go to that Google document and put it in there so that others can see it. And then come back and check that document before the quarter's over with and download it and keep it as a little gift so that maybe you've got some new ideas to use there. Okay, let's end by summarizing here. I'm going to go ahead and tell you this is going to be a busy slide, but I just want you to be able to see all this stuff because I just think it's so important. Okay, first of all, if we're really serious, again, about reaching the farthest out kids, we can't rely primarily on large group attractional events. I'm not trying to step on your toes if you do have large group attractional events. I'm just saying we can't rely primarily on that. I want to encourage you to include an incarnational missional approach, which is going, not inviting just to come in, but to go where kids are. Evangelism and discipleship takes trust and time. We're dealing with adolescents who are working to integrate multiple selves. Remember that? They're trying to figure at their core who they are. So it takes time because evangelism and discipleship are about transformation into a core self. And this is not the same thing as giving information. So we have to have this kind of long-term view of what we're doing in discipleship and evangelism with kids. We have to earn the right to be heard, earn the right to be trusted, earn the right to listen, and earn their trust while committed to non-judgmental, unconditional friendships and our commitment to preaching Christ. Faith grows in two directions. That's another reason why it takes so long, because we have to learn what it is we're for and we have to unlearn what it is that we've given ourselves to. So change is a journey of learning and unlearning. That was the vertical arrows I showed you in that funnel slide previously. It takes place through a person's willingness to align their deep longings with the theological longings they were made for. This is the real challenge of discipleship. It's realigning longings, getting to the foundational, deepest longings they have, while also helping them unlearn the rival narratives or the liturgies that they have that have convincingly promised to meet their deep desires. Of course, they never do. And we do this all within relationships of trust. And then lastly, discipleship happens best in community versus the idea of just a single mentor or even an individual in their own discipleship. It's the body of Christ. I hope I made that clear, especially in those last two sections of the funnel. It's a diversity of relationships in that body that have the best chance of being a mentoring community to form kids. Kids need to be able to see it lived out. So for them, their normative way of understanding what Christianity is what we're for. Now, again, I said it before, but just one last reminder. Youth workers have to be the influence to create the vision for this kind of relationship, for this kind of receiving, sending community. And again, if you don't work in a youth ministry, please be an advocate for this kind of influence. Please step in wherever there are adults in the community where you are. See as your responsibility imparting this kind of vision for them so they see the value of their relationships with adolescents here in this. Okay, we're going to have part 2 next week where we'll talk a little bit more about how to decide what part of the funnel you actually do in your ministry setting based on your own particular needs, your own particular resources, and that sort of thing that are available to you. So we'll get a little more specific there. But I think we're going to stop right now where we got. So good work making it all the way through to this point in the lecture. And I will look forward to being with you again soon. Take care, everybody.